What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a follow-up video of sorts to a video I did a couple days ago about Avowed's various reveals from Xbox Developer Direct. Just yesterday, from the time of this video, they followed that showcase up with a pre-recorded podcast on the Xbox podcast, where they dived a little further into some of these details and gave a few answers to questions I myself asked in that original video. So naturally, I wanted to talk about some of that, and of course, show off some of the extended gameplay that they showed, some of which is things we hadn't seen yet. Starting off with one of, I think, the most interesting things is that I myself asked questions from their Developer Direct about how they were implementing abilities and things like that into Avowed, as they were clearly pulling some of them from Pillars of Eternity, the isometric series this game is using the setting from, and how that would lean into progression. And while they didn't dive into a great amount of detail, they did talk about how there would be skill trees. Now, they didn't go into great detail on this, and at one point they referred to it as skill trees, and then at another point they mentioned multiple ability trees, so it's hard to say if all of this is just uniform for every character, or if you'll make some kind of class choice and then be assigned skill trees after that. What we do know from what they've said here is that they took a look at all of the trees from Pillars of Eternity, presumably Deadfire, who has a convenient layout of these things, where they then pulled and recategorized them. So at the very least, now we know for sure that the game is using a skill tree system, though whether that is influenced by any other progression choice such as some sort of class pick, etc. is unknown. What we do know though is that you can in fact respect this, as they want builds to be a thing but also don't want to make it impossible to try out something else. So from the sounds of it, these respecs won't be free, but will be accessible enough if you'd like to try something else. And on my end, if I could hazard a guess, I would say that I think it's not unreasonable that there's likely different skill trees for various types of weapons and or specific groupings of abilities such as assault, defense, etc. But whether or not any of this is influenced at all by something like a class choice would be interesting to me. As in one portion of the Developer Direct, we see a dialogue choice with some kind of icon next to it, which makes me think overall there's clearly something more to this. But while that's certainly the most interesting piece of information to me, simply because they've shared so little of these progression systems, there was a lot more that they covered. The game is going to feature an elemental system, and while this has obvious combat utility, and we've seen some of that in the gameplay already, such as using ice to freeze enemies and then smashing them with power attacks which shatters them into pieces, it turns out that environmentally this will also come into play, with you having the ability to do things like freeze water, burn your way through certain brambles, alongside a couple other things, basically the things you would expect from an elemental system. Speaking of environments though, it also appears we'll be able to do a little bit of swimming, which does make me curious how involved any amount of that exploration will be. As I do think it's fun, you can occasionally dive into water and find something hidden in games. They then went on to discuss choice and consequence a little bit. Now, obviously they were a little light on details here, if only to avoid spoilers, but the question was asked whether or not the impact that your character can make on the world will be substantial. And to this, they respond that yes, your actions will have consequences for individual characters. I imagine, what happens to them, of course, alongside things with your companions, but also how your actions involve and affect the various communities that you'll come into contact with, which I would imagine is the colonial settlements of the few empires that have made landfall on the living lands. But unsurprisingly, it does appear there will be some choice and consequence in an Obsidian game. Speaking of companions though, they did confirm that Giada from the Developer Direct is in fact a companion, though that was pretty heavily implied. But they also talked about her and the previously announced companion Kai's role in combat, saying that they could take on roles that you would traditionally find in a party, such as a tank or support, allowing them to be more actively engaged, and that each of them has ties to individual areas of the game. For instance, they talked about how Kai has ties to the area of Shatterscarp and the settlement from Rauatai, further explaining that each companion will have specific reasons to want to be traveling with you, the envoy of the Adir Empire, and that many of them will have ties to individual areas, so it's likely they'll be pretty heavily involved in our questing and be a substantial part of the story at play. And if you've played, especially I would say Deadfire, that's hardly a surprise. Many of the companions in that title had specific ties to individual factions, and the conflicts that you would involve yourself between those factions and how you resolved them, of course, had heavy implications for all of your companions. Not to mention that that's just a general approach that Obsidian likes to take to companions, so I would imagine something similar here isn't entirely out of the ballpark. But then we got another particularly interesting piece of information, which is the Dream Scourge, which appears to be the name of the spiritual plague that is making its way through the living lands, and one of the reasons for our presence. We're there to investigate it. And in this podcast, they put that name to the title, and in fact, even in some of the gameplay, we see things referred to as dream thralls. And while it's nice to have a name for that, I think it is potentially a little more interesting than it might initially sound, because the Pillars of Eternity series, and thus the world of Eora at large, has a lot to do with animancy, or the study of the soul. It comes up across their games. It's like the big central thing. So naturally, when you hear spiritual plague, it's obviously probably going to lean into that. And while dream might not necessarily sound connected to that, a common theme that comes up in Pillars of Eternity is memories of the past in particular, and oftentimes in-game that's represented as dreams people are having. And given that, there's also been allusions to the fact that your character, the Envoy of Adir, is supposed to have some personal connection to the living lands, which is bizarre because of the untamed nature of them. I think it's not unreasonable to suggest that the Dream Scourge might just have something to do with people's past lives popping up, and perhaps even your own, but I don't want to speculate too much or get too lost in the lore here, because really we don't know just yet, but there are some connections that name could potentially imply. But overall, I think that just about covers all of the interesting things I spotted in this further examination of the upcoming Avowed, though with the game releasing in just fall of this year, I don't imagine we'll have to wait too much longer for any of that content to come out, and to that end, I'll be covering every bit of that. This is one of my most anticipated games this year, so if you're looking forward to more news on it, do remember to subscribe and stick around, and leave a like and comment while you're at it. But that's going to do it for this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed it, but regardless, thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.